Hello, everyone, and welcome back for part 3 of our session on assessment. This is the final session that we're going to talk about assessment on for the year. And this is actually something that, interestingly enough, this idea that we're going to talk about today is a single point rubric. And this is an idea that was presented to me after the set of topics about assessment that we did in the previous year came out. One of my colleagues in the county I teach in told me about single point rubrics and how much he loved teaching with single point rubrics. So, my research on this topic has definitely been generated through discussions with him and a few of my other colleagues in my county, and I think this is something important to consider for just about anyone teaching these classes. And again, I'll be brutally honest about this particular idea that if I grade with a rubric, oftentimes I give grades that may be lower than what I really wanted the student to have for the project. It may have been where they fell on the rubric, but I'm not sure I designed the rubric to hit the grade target that I was hoping for the students to have. It's not my goal to crush any student's grades because I decided to grade with a rubric. I think rubrics are good to keep you honest in your grading practices. I think rubrics can be very, very beneficial in ensuring you anchor your teaching and learning in standards-based instruction, which is extremely, extremely, extremely important. I just think that sometimes they're really difficult to make. And honestly, sometimes they're hard to use, and I don't know that they always give the students the feedback that I really want them to have. Realistically, I'm far more concerned that the students enjoy and relish the feedback that I'm giving them instead of just the grade number that I'm giving them. So I'm constantly trying to think, like, how do I put all this into play so that my feedback is the thing that they're keying the most off of. So as we talk about this, I hope you'll kind of see how this generates an important focus on the feedback. So how can we effectively make our assessments more functional? Well, the single point rubric is the idea here. So a single point rubric is a rubric system with a single column that defines the criteria rather than a full menu of performance levels. So here you're not thinking beginning, developing, proficient, exemplary. You're thinking like, this is the criteria. Did the student hit it or did the student miss it? That's all we're really focusing on here is, did they hit the criteria that I established for them? Or did they miss it? Or did they exceed it? And let's tell them how they did. So in the single point rubric, teachers begin to find them easier and faster to create because they no longer have to spend precious time making up all these different ways that a student could fail to meet the expectation. And I know you've had to experience that. You've worked long and hard to create a rubric that tells students how they work through rhythms. And then you think that you thought of every way they could possibly not meet your standard on building a rubric so that they have the beginning level covered with what mistakes they might make, and then they go and make a mistake that's entirely different than the one you figured out that they might make. Well, that's frustrating because then you have to find a way to communicate with them what their mistake was, and oftentimes if you're using some rubric-based tools, it's just put a dot on the number that they choose, and that's all the feedback they get. So maybe this is better for those. And students might find them easier to read when they're preparing assignment and know more of the targeted expectation. And if they look simpler to read, students might actually read them. Hey, who knew? And they allow for higher quality feedback because teachers must specify key problem areas and notable areas of excellence for that particular student rather than just choosing from a list of generic descriptions. I will say this does require a bit more time on the teacher end, but if the time is spent giving good feedback that makes the students better, I think that's worth it. So, what is a single point rubric? Well, each graded standard is given a single statement defining the criteria or the goal for that project. On each side of the statement, there's a box placed to communicate whether the student has areas to improve on or if there were aspects of that standard or criteria where the students exceeded the expectation and we want to tell them about it. So, here is a very basic idea that I think we could all identify with pretty easily for a quick understanding of a single point rubric. If you were to receive breakfast in bed, one of your children decided to serve you breakfast in bed. The criteria would be that the food is at the correct temperature, adequately seasoned, and cooked to the eater's preference. The presentation, it was served on a clean tray with a napkin and silverware, maybe some decorative additions to be present. Not maybe, this would require that those be there. And then comfort, the recipient is woken up gently, assisted in seat adjustment, and given a reasonable time and space to eat. So, if your son or daughter brought you breakfast in bed and the pancakes were seasoned with seasoning salt and not sugar, then that might be an area that they need to improve. But if the presentation was done with a bouquet of flowers as well, maybe that exceeds excellence or exceeds the standard. And then if they came in and woke you up by jumping on the bed first, maybe that would be an area for improvement, that they need to not jump on the bed, but gently assist the person in waking up. So that would just be a very basic understanding of a single point rubric and how it could be applied. Now, the advantage, it's simple. The single point rubric has much less text than other rubric styles. The odds that your students are actually going to read the whole thing is increasing, and they can reflect on given feedback and remember that both are much higher there. The advantages of single point rubrics continue with giving you space to reflect on both the strengths and weaknesses in the student work. Each category invites teachers to meaningfully share what they did really well and where they might want to consider making adjustments. It doesn't place boundaries on student performance. So whereas some rubrics kind of define a stopping place for the student, like you've hit this, you've hit the top, don't go any further, the single point rubric encourages them to continue on and be exemplary and try different things. So we actually want them to have this intellectual curiosity toward making this their own. It also works against students' tendency to rank themselves and to compare themselves and compete with one another. We all know that we've given rubrics and students go, I did better than you on the rubric. Well, maybe not. Maybe the students don't understand your percentages and how you would grade specific categories harder or things like that. But this gives them specific feedback for their work. But it's not easy to necessarily quantify a final grade. It's also kind of why I like it, because I can be like, oh, I really think the student deserves a 92 on this project, but there were some areas that I thought that they were not meeting the standard, and I'm going to tell them that, but I don't want it to be like, oh, well, I added up all the points and you got a 78. Tough. It helps take the student attention off of the final grade, which is exactly my biggest qualm with all of this, is that I want the student to care more about the feedback than the grade. So that's one of the big things here. And it creates more flexibility without sacrificing clarity. Students are still given clear explanations for the grade they earned, but there is much more room to account for, intellectual curiosity and doing things a different way. The disadvantage, it requires a little bit more writing on the part of the teacher at grading time. However, if the goal is to focus on feedback, then this can play a huge role in allowing the teacher to provide that feedback and the student to connect with that feedback. And I think that is very important. To close this all out, I kind of want to give you an example of a super basic single point rubric that you might use on a project. I didn't necessarily make this for a specific project, just some points that you might want to consider. Rhythm lined up well with each other and the appropriately aligned with the time signature. Boom. Do they have areas for improvement? Did they exceed the standard? Melodic ideas align with the harmonic material and has the appropriate balance of repetition and diversity. Areas for improvement exceeds the standard. Boom. And these are all lined up with your Georgia creation standards as well. The musical work exhibits AABA format. Boom, boom. They included an intro and an outro as well. Evidence of exceeding. They didn't have a B section. They just went AAAA. Area for improvement. We need to create a B section. The file is appropriately balanced and titled, and is the format ready for publication. They turned in a project that was titled Project 12, and that doesn't really tell you anything about the thing, so that may be an area for improvement. So just consider these things. The student can be still graded with effective feedback, and this balances your feedback to your ability to be more fluid with the actual grade that you give a student. So I hope these series of assessment videos have maybe challenged the way you think about assessment. You might agree, you might totally disagree. I would love to hear if you have other ideas, especially those that totally disagree with this, and you can share those in the forum here and the discussion post. The difference and the disagreements are what help us all grow. So I would appreciate that feedback and the discussions that we can have around that. I appreciate all of you taking the time to watch this. Hope you have enjoyed. Thank you for your time.